Welcome to Dark Dreams.
The moon is full and it is dripping with blood.
Now comes Blood Moon Rising magazine.
Original fiction,
Creature features,
nightmarish artwork.
interviews, and other original horror.
Visit bloodmoonrisingmagazine.com and join our rising legion.
Slippery Stan by Jeremy Maddux. Growing up, summers for Jeremiah West meant long car rides into the country with an agitated father and his wife who humored his temper. His parents left him with his grandparents from June to August, as it was the only time of the year he saw his grandparents other than Christmas. There were things Jeremiah loved about the country: long, sprawling fields, the way they came alive at night with 1,000 different voices, the hummingbirds and the dragonflies, the money he earned from his grandfather for plowing, planting, and trap setting. The visits, however, had one hideous drawback that caused him to swear every year upon returning home that he would never again return. It was the creature that lurked over a certain threshold just between the pantry door and the cubby-hole under the attic stairs. He could always tell of the creature's arrival because of the sulphurous scent that peppered the air, and the rhythms of the adults' conversations would shift into a strange stop-and-go cadence. Then the creature would burst quietly into the room. Sometimes he crawled down the wall. Others he popped out of the oven, regardless of whether or not there was anything cooking. Mostly, he liked to appear behind an old crocheted quilt of a golden-maned lion, and rise up through the handmade fibers like fish cutting through eddying pools of water. He always introduced himself as Slippery Stan because of the wet trail his pus-filled, sore-covered feet left where he walked. He stayed only a few minutes, and toyed with Jeremiah by suggesting new hiding places where he wouldn't find him next time. Jeremiah's grandparents played along the first few years, before advising him to stop watching monster movies too late. When Jeremiah was 13, Stan's visits became more frequent and aggressive. He would wake up with unexplained welts and bruises at night. His grandfather told him to stop roughhousing with the dogs so much. On one graying summer evening, as torrents of cool air battered the sun-broached acreage, Jeremiah decided to take his stand against Slippery Stan. He had captured a locust in a jar, and displayed it proudly to his grandparents as they played cards at the dining-room table. They ate dinner without incident, but it was while Jeremiah ate his dessert of homemade cookie dough ice cream that he noticed the timbre of his grandparents' discussion change to a flat, meandering, only to rise up once again. "You know," said his grandmother, "I think I'll go fish. Careful now with the ice cream, son," his grandfather said. "Don't want an ice cream headache." Jeremiah darted under the table as quickly as he could, his nostrils filled with that odor of sulphur, that aromatic crackle that foretold always of his impending doom. "Say welcome home to Slippery Stan, Jeremiah," the creature shouted, kicking open the pantry door and collapsing dramatically to one knee to peer at the boy. Jeremiah cried out to his grandparents for help, but knew they would do nothing. He was right. They went on with their card game as he battled for his life. Grandpa even suggested that he would eventually tire himself out with his theatrics and go to bed. Slippery Stan's neck stretched like elastic to join Jeremiah under the table. He gnashed his jagged nails of teeth at Jeremiah. His face was a mask of malice that soon gave way to a new mood as he beheld the jar that had slipped off the table. Jeremiah saw Slippery Stan afraid for the first time. "You room with insects, boy?" hissed Slippery Stan as he moved away from the table. Jeremiah picked up the jar containing the locust and came out from under the table, holding it before him to act as a repellent, all the while shaking violently at the knees. "About time you came out from under there," said Grandma. "That's right, Stan, and there's more where he came from." Jeremiah loosed the lid on the jar and removed the locust. It flittered and buzzed uncomfortably in his hand, threatening to get away, but Jeremiah clutched his new weapon firmly. He had Stan running scared now. Slippery Stan stumbled backward, knocking a broom onto his gaping wound of a foot. Suddenly, Jeremiah's grandmother knocked the locust from his hand and stomped it under her slipper. "Jeremiah West, clean this mess up and get up to bed," said Grandma. Slippery Stan regained his composure and carefully slithered upward until he was back on his feet. He craned his head and stared intently at Jeremiah, so the whites of his eyes were more visible than his jet-black pupils. "The next time you see me, boy, you won't be quite so lucky as you have been tonight. There will be gnashing of teeth, and a sustained agony you have earned by consorting with vermin." With that, Stan was gone, but his warning was enough to keep Jeremiah from sleeping for long periods. He began to arm himself for battle. The next day he went deep into the fields with a bag of jars, containers, and bug barns. He caught all manner of bugs and insects. Vermin was what Slippery Stan called them. It was obviously a weakness of his, possibly the only one, but it was enough for Jeremiah to exploit. It gave him the hope he had wished for in previous summers. He went about plucking grasshoppers from tobacco leaves, scraping slugs off the Davenport, toppling ants from their hills of empires, catching June bugs and Japanese beetles. He even procured some hornets for a nest, and a praying mantis perched on a porch light. Most of all, he made sure to capture every one of the plentiful locusts he came across, until he probably had a swarm of them. He arranged the jars and containers around his bed in a cautious symmetry. The ones that were left he placed on top of the television, nightstand, and windowsill. A scream sliced through the nighttime silence. It came from his grandparents' room down the hall. He threw back the covers and leapt from bed, tripping over 3 of the jars. He heard one shatter against the floor and another roll under his bed. He rushed down the hall, grasping as many as he could. At the threshold of the bedroom he saw the slick, scaly visage of Slippery Stan, daring his grandfather to run at him. For the first time they could see him too. "Jeremiah!" squeaked Grandpa. "Get Grandma's pills! She's having an attack and needs her pills! Top drawer, nightstand!" "Hello, old friend," said Slippery Stan, beckoning Jeremiah to come closer. Jeremiah raised up one of the bug jars and displayed it to Stan, who hissed with contempt. Grandpa ripped a golf club loose from his caddy bag and brought it down with a wind-whooshing thwack across Stan's head and shoulders. The putting end was embedded in the back of Stan's head, yet his hideousness lived on. With Stan distracted, Jeremiah threw the ammunition of jars at him, breaking them in a succession of 3 right at his feet. Locusts flew over broken glass like buzzing ships sailing over broken tides. They swarmed up his knees, knocking him flat on his back in screaming hysterics. The hornets in another jar weren't too far behind, burying their stingers in him from his left shoulder down to his pectoral region. The praying mantis also left its mark. Stan was well and truly powerless to fight these tiny hostilities which had taken hold of him. He rolled on the floor as if on fire, then darted to his feet into the hallway. He slipped over his own slimy trail and collided headfirst with a lamp in the hallway. Stan willed himself onto his aching knees and found himself staring into the segmented back of a cockroach. He howled in terror, and Jeremiah recognized it as the sound he used to make. Jeremiah quickly fetched his grandmother's pills and handed them to Grandpa. "Where do you think you're going, son?" asked Grandpa as he coaxed 2 tablets into his wife's mouth. "That's the same son of a bitch I've been seeing for years now, and you finally see him too. Now I know I'm not crazy. I'm going to finish him off forever," Jeremiah said, rushing down the hallway, leaping over Stan's trembling husk, and retrieving the rest of the bug jars from his room. "How would you like some June bugs in July, Stan?" taunted Jeremiah as he hurled the jar at him, shattering it against his forehead. Stan fell backwards, knocking his head against a hall closet door, which collapsed under his weight. "Thought you might have some fun with these, too," he shouted as he dropped a handful of grasshoppers on Stan, causing him to shriek inwardly like a child. With his mouth wide open, Jeremiah opened a jar filled with slugs and snails and poured them down his vulnerable gillet. "Here's some gastropods to wash it all down." He broke another jar against the wall as ants rained down on the beast. "They say ants can carry 50 times their own weight. Let's see if they can carry you away, Stanley." The insects were crawling everywhere now, leaving their marks all over his sensitive skin. Jeremiah knew Stan was dying. "I brought your favorite for dessert." Jeremiah brought out the last one, a Tupperware container filled with 12 locusts. "No, wait," negotiated Stan. "I can give you power. Don't send me back. They do things there are no words for." "Do it, Jeremiah. Don't listen to evil's words." "What did that power get you? You're like a little girl, jumping at every bug you see. Even I'm not afraid of a grasshopper or a locust." "Jeremiah, there are thresholds in this world you will never cross. Get them off me!" The vermin were very insistent on remaining where they were. There was something about Stan that attracted them. With a decisive motion, Jeremiah released the swarm of locusts on Stan and went to join his grandparents, who had aged considerably more that night. "Next time, hide in the basement," cried Jeremiah through tears, remembering all the time Stan strung him along, waiting to be killed. This night, he had won. Jeremiah and his grandparents didn't talk about that night for the rest of the summer. It eventually receded into his memory like a vivid dream. When he turned 14, his parents decided he was old enough to stay home for the summer if he wanted to, but he was anxious to get back to his grandparents to see if he had really imagined it. His grandfather had found an old trunk in the basement filled with objects from the past, a coin collection, a blued bayonet, seashells, old newspaper clippings. He showed Jeremiah one about a man named Stanley Daly, who had died alone as an old eccentric in the house. It said he would make frequent calls to the exterminator, sometimes as much as 3 a month, to take care of several problems, from termites to roaches, ants, spiders, and even bedbugs. It also mentioned in passing the rumors of Stanley Daly's immense interest in the occult, and how he often spent hours at the library looking up things no real Christian ought to be messing with, according to the librarian. Jeremiah's bedroom became an entomologist's dream. He slept with all sorts of bugs, rodents, and reptiles in cages, which his grandparents would always make him turn loose at the end of summer. He sometimes thought of the old saying, "Don't let the bedbugs bite," and realized, if that was the worst thing that happened to him, he'd be okay for the rest of his life.
I say every house in America should have an electric chair. And every man just once in his life should sit in it, just so that he can feel the power of millions of gallons of electricity flow through his veins. I got an electric chair, that's all I need. You get an electric chair, Sheldon, you don't have to worry about the audience. You get an electric chair, you can tell them anything you want, as long as it's real. You get yourself an electric chair and they'll sit there all night long. Kind of a funny idea, sitting in an electric chair and doing a show. Well, think of the therapeutic value of an electric chair and all the money it is. Yes, sir, an electric chair in every home.
The Electric Chair, a show about horror. ElectricChairShow.com.
An electric chair. Wow.
Daddy Man by Elizabeth Massey. Daddy Man stretched out his leg on the seat and ran the knife down the length of soft denim. If there had been a God, Daddy would have been down on his knees at this very moment, praying fervently and laying out his needs before the power. Daddy Man had never been one to ignore any possible avenue to achieve his purposes. Sometimes he wished there was a God, but if wishes were horses, his mother had told him as a child, then beggars would ride. And if wishes were weapons, then Daddy and his family would have rid the world of the country-destroying, mind-polluting communist bastards long ago. But wishes were nothing but wishes, and Daddy's ammunition was long spent. The hunting vest Daddy Man wore offered some small comfort, smelling and feeling of the old days. It was thick and heavy, weighed down with the bulk of its own canvas and the supply of small hand tools and blades. Daddy's shirt was red flannel, his watch waterproof. Daddy was not old, but wise in his 39 years. His beard was as his hair, brown, touched with gray. Lucy entered the kitchen and took a seat across the old table from Daddy Man. Her hair, once long and full and red, now was close cut and dull. Her face was without makeup. Her left jaw was swollen slightly where Daddy had performed an emergency molar extraction. "Donnie and Tiger are awake," she said. "I told them they didn't need to make the beds. I told them to skip their baths this morning, too." Daddy Man nodded, watching the knife moving along the leg of his jeans. The children's baths for the past months had consisted of quick swabbings with damp rags and bottled water, but even dabbing off the night grime didn't matter anymore. Lucy crossed her legs in her manly way and said nothing. Daddy could hear the sounds of the two older children rising in their rooms down the short hall. This morning their voices were not interspersed with the usual shrieks and grunts of bickering. The boy and girl knew that today was the day of decision, and there was a touching sense of childish reverence in their quietness, a reverence that made Daddy Man's chest tighten in pride. After a moment, Lucy stood and moved across the scarred vinyl floor to look out of the window above the sink. She held the filmy-yellowed curtain back and gazed for only a minute, then let the curtain fall again. The window itself was nailed shut, as were most of the windows in Daddy's home. The less contaminated filth from the outside allowed to filter in, the better. The children's bedroom window was nailed, as was the bedroom that Daddy shared with Lucy and the baby. Only the bathroom window, which was the size of a shoebox, remained unnailed so a bit of air could circulate. It was May now, and very hot, but the fans which had run continuously in the latter part of April no longer ran. The air conditioner Lucy had rummaged from the bin behind the Salvation Army Center last year no longer buzzed in the master bedroom. Daddy Man's home did not have electrical power anymore. They had cut it off. The people outside. People who claimed to be concerned Americans, whose minds already were softened into foul soil rich for foreigners' seed. "Do you want tea?" Lucy asked. Daddy Man put the knife on the tabletop. He wiped sweat from the flesh of his neck and licked it from his hand. "A little," he said. He tried to cough, but nothing came out. His throat was too dry. "When I was alone in the Smoky Mountains for 7 months, I sometimes went for days without a drink of anything." "I know," said Lucy, and of course she did. Daddy knew she knew. But it was a small sense of pleasure to remember those days. His family allowed him that pleasure, and heard his tales with respect. Daddy told his stories of rebirth in the wild, and of his respective revelation of man as his own enemy. Daddy had learned that all foul things spring from the perverted human mind, be it recreational drugs, immigrant amnesty, space exploration, farming co-ops, arms talks, or public education. Daddy had met Lucy at an anti-communist camp session in the wilderness of Utah, each one sporting semi-automatic weapons and packs of dried food. They fell in love, but did not marry, feeling that ultimately survival was an individual task, and no adult could have charge over another. After Donnie and Tiger came, Daddy Man and Lucy moved to upstate New York and built a 2-room cabin in the national park. With the birth of the baby, they deserted the cabin and moved the family to the home where they now resided, knowing that of all possible homes this, for the time being, was the best. It was the most inconspicuous in its location. Lucy mixed a spoonful of plain instant tea with a portion of bottled water. She stirred the tea and handed it to Daddy Man. He took it, and as he did, he caught the back of Lucy's hand with a quick thumb caress. She did not smile, but her eyes closed briefly in response. Daddy could see the cords and veins beneath the gritty sheen of sweat on her thin neck, straining and pumping with the tired yet persistent current of life. Donnie was the first child in the kitchen, rubbing his eyes and shuffling in his flip-flops. His shorts were cut-offs from Daddy Man's old camouflage pants. They were gathered about the boy's small waist with a leather belt drawn through the loops. The boy wore no shirt, and his chest and arms were shiny with perspiration. "I'm thirsty," he said simply, and Lucy mixed him a cup of tea. Normally, Lucy would have asked Donnie if he wanted breakfast. With the diminishing supply of food and the inactivity of the confined children, they often weren't hungry at the beginning of the day, but today Lucy opened a can of military surplus turkey and spooned a small bit onto a piece of Melba toast. Donnie ate it without speaking, but watching his father. "May I hold that?" Donnie asked Daddy after a moment, indicating the knife on the table. Daddy handed it to his son. "Thank you," said Donnie, and he did not parry with the knife as he usually did, but held it close in his lap. Tiger entered the kitchen. She had found her old and favorite puppy t-shirt in the box in the closet where Lucy had packed it, and she had it on, although it was much too small for her 8-year-old body, and it held to her frame like the wrapping on a pack of sausage. Lucy fixed tea for Tiger, and gave her the cold turkey on toast. Lucy opened a can of white corn for herself, leaving nothing on the counter but the container of tea. There was no food left, although Lucy and Daddy Man had shopped carefully last October, loading crates upon crates of generic foodstuffs into their Jeep, stocking up on Triton water and canned juices. It was all gone. Daddy Man stood, offering his chair to Tiger, who had been standing with her tea and toast. He put his hands into his jeans pockets and leaned against the wall. He had been sure that the end would come before their food gave out. The Great War was on its way. Not a nuclear war. He never believed the world would actually be blown up. But the enemy was destined to invade America and end freedom. In fact, they were already infiltrating. Screw what the liberals thought was a new, open friendship between the two countries. The invaders would make a clean sweep of the United States with the help of deluded American government officials, paying particular attention to the mountains and forests where the survivalists lived, rounding them up and putting them into re-education programs or mental hospitals, or summarily executing them. Daddy Man had planned on laying low, keeping his family where they were, waiting until the sweep was over and the woods were safe again. Then he and Lucy and Tiger and Donnie and the baby would go there again. They could live off the land as he had been trained, as far away from the pollution and tyranny as possible, and exist unto themselves. But the war hadn't come, at least not yet, and the family's food was gone. For the past 2 days, people had begun to gather about the outside of their home, telling Daddy Man and his family to come out, telling him that his children were to be in school, shouting that the rent hadn't been paid and they were being evicted. Daddy Man didn't listen to their talk, but shouted a warning before tossing out a grenade. This had brought on police and bullhorns and threats of storming the home. "Come out," they demanded. "You can't stay in there forever." "We'll do what we have to do," Lucy had screamed and tossed out another grenade. It was quiet for a few hours after that, until there came hammering at the front door, and Donnie and Daddy opened fire through the wood. This stopped the invaders, and they retreated again to their flashing lights and sirens and bullhorns and whispered plans of what to do next. Then the electricity was cut off, and then the water, and Daddy realized that perhaps his own brain was softer than he had known, because his plan was proving to be weak, and the family was being fucked. Daddy Man went into the living room. He slipped the sliding door open a fraction, put his nose through the opening, and ground his teeth against each other, trying to think. The sky was a faint blue, and the clouds white, mindless things, having no clue as to the havoc wreaked below them. "Do you want something to eat?" called Lucy from the kitchen. "No," Daddy said, closing the door again and turning back to the living room. He looked at the single shelf beside the flowered sofa, and at the stacks of magazines which once had meant so much to him. They had gone untouched recently. He was too tired, too distracted to read. In a chest beneath the shelf was his collection of guns, machetes, and knives. There also had been ammunition once, but his anger at the discovery by the outsiders and his fear of failure had allowed it to be used up much too quickly. Even little Tiger had shot more furiously than ever before, crying all the while. But the police were nimble. They hid from the barrage and taunted the family. And now his best weapons were rendered useless. He was a failure. Poor planning. Fucked up world. Donnie brought his cup of tea into the living room. He was still holding his father's knife. Daddy took the knife and pressed the blade to his finger. He dragged it along the flesh. A ragged line of blood beaded from the cut. "You see," he said to his son, "this is what all humans are. Blood and bones and pain. And we need freedom, or none of it is worth preserving." Donnie watched in silence. Daddy pinched his finger and then sucked it to stop the bleeding. He went back to the sliding door and watched out across the small patio. He could not see anyone, but he could hear them gathering. The sun's early morning light was pink on the concrete, and a small breeze, flickering across the patio surface and stirring loose concrete chips, suddenly made Daddy Man very angry. He would kill the breeze if he could for its freedom. Lucy brought the baby in from the bedroom. The little girl's eyes were drowsy and her face was pale. She held to her mother's neck with her bony fingers and looked at her Daddy Man. Tiger followed her mother and stood in the middle of the living room floor. "It's over now," said Daddy Man. "We can't have it as we wanted. We lived as we should. We believed as we had to. And yet, it wasn't enough. Not for us. I don't understand why I couldn't make it right. I'm sorry." There were tears in Lucy's eyes, and the sight of them made Daddy's sting as well. Anger was suppressed in resignation. Daddy clenched the handle of his knife, then went to each family member. He stroked their cheeks fondly with the dull side of the blade. They managed to smile, and Daddy felt a little better. "Let's go now, if you are truly with me." All nodded. Daddy Man opened the sliding door all the way, and the family went out into the patio. The breeze was stronger here, and Daddy blinked as the air tickled his eyes. Donnie and Tiger moved to the tubular railing that surrounded the patio and looked at the crowd that had gathered. "Mr. Hanson," called a policeman with a bullhorn, "you must come out, for the sake of yourself, your wife, and especially your children." "Wife?" echoed Lucy softly, and it was almost a laugh. "Don't you see what you're doing to them?" the policeman said. "Can you see how sick they look, and how thin? You couldn't have much food left now. Do you want them to starve to death? Mr. Hanson, just give up, and we can talk." "I don't want to talk," Daddy Man called. He motioned to Lucy, who walked by his side. The baby reached for her daddy, and he took her. "Mr. Hanson!" Daddy Man looked down at the knife in his hand. He watched the blade toss fragments of sunlight about like a juggler with mystical clubs. "I don't want to talk." He raised the knife. The police could see it now, and there was frantic burst of movement. "Mr. Hanson, please don't!" Daddy Man turned toward the living room and hurled the knife through the opening. It fell softly onto the carpet, and without putting his daughter down, he worked free of his hunting vest and let it fall to the concrete floor. "Good," said the policeman. "There's no need for that. Now, if you'll just—" "We're coming," Daddy Man said. Lucy kissed Donnie and Tiger. The little boy and girl then climbed over the rail. Shouts followed their action. Lucy kissed her baby, and then her man. She followed over the rail. Daddy Man did not want to look. He did not want to see the reception of his loved ones by the scum who brought them to this. He wrapped his arm tightly about the waist of the baby and swung his leg over the rail. And the upturned, horrified faces of the policemen and the reporters and the neighbors watched as Daddy Man followed his family, plummeting 19 stories to freedom.
Thank you. Thank you.